Hey friends, tonight we begin with the extraordinary rise of Alexander the Great, the Thunder of Zeus himself. A man who carved empires with his will, walked with gods, and reshaped the very edges of the known world. But beyond the conquests and the myths lies a deeper story of ambition, loss, and a dream too vast for one lifetime. Before we dive into this journey across deserts, rivers, and legend, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the kind of storytelling we share here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always amazing to see how history reaches across time zones and sleep cycles. So now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum and get comfortable. Let's drift into the ancient world together and follow in the footsteps of a man who refused to be forgotten. Before the thunder of hooves shook the world, before empires burned in the fire of his gaze, before kings fell like grain before the sickle, there was a boy born in the stone-palaced city of Pella, in the northern kingdom of Macedon, under omens, whispered with awe and dread, the kind of omens that stir priests into silence and leave old men staring into the smoke of sacrificed bulls. They said the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned on the night of his birth, as if the gods themselves lit the world to herald him. And in his mother Olympia's chamber, snakes were seen slithering between silks and shadows, curling around her, bed-like coiled prophecies, for she claimed to have conceived not by her husband Philip, the one-eyed warrior king, who had tamed Macedon with sword and marriage, but by Zeus himself, whose thunder had entered her womb in the shape of lightning and dream. And so the child was born into a house already divided between father and mother, between earth and Olympus, between mortal ambition and divine destiny, and named Alexandros, the defender of men, his cries echoing not with the helplessness of infancy, but with the fury of someone born too early for peace. He grew in palace courtyards, where Spartan tutors taught him to stand straight and strike fast. And from his earliest days, there was a fire in him that frightened even those who praised it. His eyes, keen as hawks, his temper quicksilver, his mind hungry, not for toys or food, but for stories of Achilles and Heracles, of heroes who bled for glory and wept only for the unfulfilled promise of their youth. And his mother fed this hunger like flame to a pyre, whispering in his ear that he was no son of man, but of Olympus, destined to rule not as a king among kings, but as a god among mortals, while his father, Philip, laughed with pride and unease, watching the boy spar with older boys and correct generals with a clarity that did not belong to childhood. When Alexander was 13, Philip summoned Aristotle, the greatest philosopher in Greece, not to lecture the court, but to shape his son. And for 3 years the boy walked the groves of Mysa beside the old master, learning of ethics and logic, of Homer and the gods, of medicine, rhetoric, astronomy. Yet, for all his learning, Alexander never lost his love for epic. He carried the Iliad with him for the rest of his life, annotated by Aristotle's own hand, and in Achilles he saw not just a warrior, but a mirror, young, brilliant, doomed, hungry for immortality, not through temples or scrolls, but through the shout of his name across time. And though Aristotle urged moderation, Alexander's soul was already tilting toward the extremes of fate. For how could a child who believed he was half divine settle for anything less than all the world? Even in youth, he showed a disdain for smallness, for cowardice, for the creeping decay of compromise. And at 16, when Philip left for campaign, Alexander was left in charge of Macedon and crushed a Thracian revolt so swiftly it seemed preordained, founding a city in his own name as if foreshadowing the dozens more to come. And at 18, at the great battle of Chaeronea, it was Alexander who led the companion cavalry against the sacred band of Thebes, that legendary phalanx of elite lovers who had never known defeat till that day when Alexander shattered them with a charge so precise, so brutal, that the field was left soaked in glory and blood. And Philip, now king of all Greece, looked upon his son not merely with pride but with fear, for he had seen the future riding beside him and knew it would not be his to command. Yet the tension between father and son only deepened in those final years. Philip, forever scheming, took new wives to seal alliances, while Olympus raged and Alexander seethed, insulted at banquets, pushed aside, whispered about, until the night Philip was assassinated on the day of his daughter's wedding, struck down in the theater by one of his own guards. And whether Alexander knew of it or not, whether he grieved or merely watched in silence, he seized the moment with terrifying speed, riding to the army, securing loyalty, executing rivals, and ascending the throne of Macedon at 20, crowned in the blood mist of a father's legacy. But he was not content to rule merely Macedon, not content with the fragile alliance of the Greek city-states that bent to Macedonian power with clenched fists. Thebes rose in rebellion, and Alexander responded with fire, surrounding the city, storming its walls, and tearing it to the ground with such totality that only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. And the message echoed from Delphi to Athens. This was no boy, no regent, no pond, this was a king, and more than that, a storm wearing the shape of man. Yet even then, his eyes were already turned eastward, across the Aegean, where the great Persian Empire sprawled like a sleeping giant, bloated, ancient, magnificent hand, vulnerable. For centuries, the Persians had ruled from the mountains of Anatolia to the palaces of Persepolis, their satraps and generals entrenched like roots in every province. Their king, Darius III, heir to a lineage of fire and gold, ruling an empire that stretched farther than any Greek had ever seen. But to Alexander, it was not merely a prize, it was his destiny. The war his father had begun but never finished. The dream passed from ghost to son. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a force tiny compared to the empire he challenged, but behind them rode a will so unbending it seemed made of iron and fire. And as he stepped onto Asian soil, legend says he cast a spear into the land and claimed it as his by right of conquest, a ritual not of greed, but of inheritance. For he saw himself not as a foreign invader, but as the rightful ruler of all. The earth, ordained by Zeus, guided by Achilles, born of Philip and Olympus, shaped by Aristotle, and crowned by fate itself. And though the world did not yet know it, though the winds of Persia still carried the scent of incense and empire, the long burning march of Alexander had begun, one that would sweep through cities and gods, crush empires beneath dust and thunder, and carve a name into history so deep that even after millennia the echo of it would make mountains tremble. He crossed into Asia not as a mere king, but as a flame loosed upon the dry grasses of empire. A youth barely 22, with the name of a god on his lips and the shadows of centuries behind him. And yet, from the moment his boots sank into Anatolian soil, Alexander of Macedon shed the skin of mortal inheritance and stepped forward, not as the son of Philip, mere territory or treasure, for he had not come for borders, he had come for immortality. The army he brought was not vast by the standards of the Persian world, but it was forged of granite and spirit, men who had fought beside his father at Chaeronea and under his own flashing spear at Thebes, phalangites with 16-foot sarissa, gleaming beneath Macedonian sun, Hypaspists, armored like living bronze, and the companion cavalry, noble-born and death-hungry, whose charge would become the song of generations yet unborn. Yet, for all their valor, Alexander knew that raw courage alone would not defeat an empire stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, whose armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, whose cities glittered with wealth unimaginable to the petty kings of Greece, and whose throne ruled now by Darius III, the so-called King of Kings, rested atop centuries of divine authority and administrative genius. But it was precisely that size, that age, that weight, which Alexander intended to shatter, for he saw in it not strength, but rot. He moved with calculated fury, first defeating the satraps of western Anatolia at the Battle of the Granicus. Charge into the chaos, helmet gleaming, slashing with his own blade, nearly killed and saved only by the intervention of Cletus the Black, who severed the arm of a Persian noble just as it fell upon Alexander's exposed neck, and from that moment the myth began to grow not among his men, who already believed him more than mortal, but among his enemies, who saw that he was not bound by the normal rhythms of war, that where others advanced cautiously, he surged like lightning, capturing Sardis, accepting the submission of Greek cities long under Persian yoke, and burning Halicarnassus to ash when it dared resist him. As he marched along the Anatolian coast, he adopted not only new lands, but new titles. The tribute flowed toward Pella, or now, toward the evolving center of a kingdom no longer defined by Macedonia, but by conquest itself. It was here that Alexander's genius as both tactician and statesman emerged. He was not merely a warlord in search of glory, but a visionary who understood that to rule the world, one must make the world believe it chose to be ruled. At Gordium, but a new ethos. The gods would not dictate his destiny, he would force destiny to obey him. Yet, as he pushed eastward, word came that Darius himself was marching with a vast army to stop him, and the two titans met at Issus in 333 BCE, a narrow field hemmed by mountains and sea, where the sheer imbalance in numbers should have doomed the Macedonians, but Alexander, reading the terrain like scripture, used the bottleneck to nullify Persian advantage, riding directly into the heart of Darius's line with the companion cavalry in a wedge of steel, scattering immortals, shattering infantry until Darius turned and fled, leaving behind his chariot, his shield, his gold, and even his family, his mother, wife, and daughters, whom Alexander treated with honor, not as prisoners, but as royalty. I am your better. Offering lands and riches, if Alexander would halt his advance, but the boy who had read Achilles by torchlight laughed at compromise, declaring, I will accept only what the gods grant me, all of Persia, and pressed on, Tyre, proud island city of Phoenician might, barred its gates, trusting in its walls and its navy. Its citizens slaughtered or sold, its gods cast down, and yet even here he spared those who bent the knee, who understood the shifting shape of the world. At Gaza he was wounded again, a bolt piercing his shoulder. But he took the city by storm, and from there marched into Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, welcomed by priests and people alike who had long chafed under Persian rule. And in the sands of the western desert, Alexander undertook a pilgrimage to the oracle of Zeus at Siwa, crossing the empty silence of the desert with only a handful of men, nearly perishing in a sandstorm, until they reached the hidden oasis where the priests greeted him as son of the god. What was said inside that temple none would ever truly know, but when he emerged, he did so with the quiet certainty that he had received divine confirmation of what he already believed, that he was not merely chosen, but divine in truth, a man fated not only to conquer the world, but to change it utterly. In Alexandria, he founded the first of many cities bearing his name, laying out its grid with dreams of eternity, then turned east once more, into the heart of Persia, where Darius prepared one final stand, at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, on the wide plains of Mesopotamia. Darius arrayed the full might of his empire chariots, with scythes, cavalry drawn from every satrapy, war elephants from India, infantry beyond counting, and yet Alexander, outnumbered perhaps 5-1, maneuvered with the precision of a chess master, drawing the Persian wings outward, breaking their flanks, and once more leading a direct charge toward Darius himself, who again fled the field, this time in such disgrace that his empire unraveled in the space of a heartbeat. Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis fell in quick succession. The heart of Persia laid bare, its treasures looted and temples burned, including the palace of Xerxes, which Alexander ordered torched wither in drunken revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens, or as a symbolic end to the old world, no one knows. But the fire rose so high that it seemed to light the entire night with the death of an empire. Yet for Alexander, conquest was not an ending, it was a beginning. And rather than return to Greece as a triumphant warlord, he marched east again in pursuit of Darius, to die in a ditch found by Alexander, who mourned his fallen rival and gave him a king's burial. For Darius had been more than an enemy, he had been the last thread binding the old order. And with his death, Alexander stood alone atop the ruins of one world, staring into the shape of the next. It was here, in the wild lands of Bactria and Sogdia, that Alexander began to transform, not just in title or in garb, though he now dressed as a Persian king, with robes and diadem, and ringed by eunuchs and incense, but in vision, for he no longer saw himself as Macedonian or even Hellenic, but as the ruler of all peoples, blending cultures, marrying a Bactrian princess named Roxana, appointing Persians to high office, demanding his men bow in the Persian fashion, and slowly, steadily, alienating the very generals and soldiers who had followed him through 1,000 miles of dust and death. Was accused of conspiracy, Alexander had him executed. From that moment, a cold wind blew through the ranks, for the king they had followed was no longer one of them, but something else, something distant, divine, and dangerous. And yet none could leave, for they were bound not by loyalty alone, but by the sheer weight of the vision they had helped build a new world, half-born, still dripping with the blood of its fathers. Of all maps, where dragons and demons were said to live, and where Alexander, son of Philip, son of Zeus, meant to carve his final crown. The river was narrow and fast, a silver scar slicing across the Anatolian plain, its waters swollen with spring melt and the promise of death. And as Alexander stood at its bank, watching the Persian cavalry massing on the far side with spears, like reeds in the wind and banners rippling in the rising sun, he did not hesitate, did not consult the stars or wait for the perfect hour. He simply mounted his steed, pointed across the Granicus, and ordered the trumpet blown, for his war had not begun with caution and would not be remembered for it. This was May of 334 BCE, and the first great test of his campaign, where the gathered Persian satraps, confident in numbers and position, lined their ranks with hardened warriors and Greek mercenaries, paid in silver and vengeance, men who had once fought beside Alexander's countrymen and now stood as the empire's sword against the boy king from Macedon. The generals at Alexander's side counseled delay, warned of the slippery banks, the chaos of a river charge, the danger of storming a fortified shore, but he, young and burning, knew the pulse of battle did not wait for perfect geometry, and with the cry of Ares on his lips and the companions behind him, he drove into the torrent, water exploding around hooves and iron. And as arrows hissed from the enemy ranks, he held his shield high and pressed forward, slicing through the spray, toward a line of lances and death. The battle at Granicus was not clean, it was a maelstrom of confusion. Horses flailing in current, men pulled beneath the surface and drowned in armor. Screams tangled with foam and blood, but Alexander charged directly for the Persian nobility clustered on the high ground, knowing that the head of the snake was its pride, and in a clash of steel and roar, he fought hand to hand beneath a hail of javelins, his helmet torn by a blade, his life nearly ended by a Persian noble whose axe arced for his scullone, for Cletus the Black, to strike down the assassin mid-blow, earning a place in legend and saving the life of the man who would soon hold half the world in his hands. When the dust settled, the Persian cavalry lay broken, and the Greek mercenaries who had held the rear were encircled and massacred in grim retribution. For Alexander would not tolerate countrymen turned mercenaries. In his first victory, not when he was writing the first line of a myth he intended to last forever. From there, the floodgates opened. Sardis surrendered without resistance, and Ephesus, Miletus, and Halicarnassus followed, the latter only falling after bitter siege, its walls resisting until Alexander's engineers and sappers shattered its gates with fire and weight. And though he burned the Persian citadel, he spared the temples and honored local customs, presenting himself not as a destroyer, but as the bringer of new dawn. And whether they believed him or not, the people saw their former overlords fled or dead, and in the vacuum stepped this golden-haired monarch with the fire of Ares and the favor of Zeus. But Alexander was no mere conqueror. He governed as he advanced, reinstating democracies in Ionian cities long held under tyrants, allowing the League of Corinth's banners to fly beside his own, creating the illusion of liberation even as his authority grew absolute. And with each passing month, more men flocked to his banner. Greeks, Thracians, even Persians, disillusioned with Darius's absentee rule, and the army he led began to change, not only in size, but in soul. They marched eastward through Phrygia and Cilicia, through mountain passes where mists curled like ghosts and local kings groveled for favor. And as they crossed into Syria, word came that Darius had finally roused the full might of Persia and was marching to crush the upstart. The encounter came at Issus in November 333 BCE. In a narrow plain, hemmed by the sea and the mountains, where the Persian host dwarfed Alexander's in-numbered bow, was caught off guard by terrain and momentum, and once more the boy king proved that numbers alone meant nothing against precision and vision. He feigned retreat, then struck the left flank with his phalanx, while leading the companions in a wedge toward the center, scattering immortals, cleaving through Darius's elite guard. And when the King of Kings saw the dust cloud of Macedonian cavalry tearing through the heart of his army, he turned his chariot and fled, his soldiers watching in disbelief as their sovereign disappeared into the chaos. Left behind in his royal tent were his wife, mother, and daughters, whom Alexander treated with respect and nobility, instructing that none should be harmed, none humiliated, for he understood that to conquer Persia he must not only defeat its armies but claim its moral mantle. And in sparing Darius's family, he presented himself to the East not as a destroyer, but as the true heir of the empire, more honorable than the man who had ruled it. After Issus, the world-trembled cities fell without siege. Satraps offered tribute, and envoys from distant lands came to kiss his hand, while Darius sent letters offering land, gold, and the hand of his daughter, if only Alexander would stop. But the son of Zeus laughed, declaring that as long as Darius lived, the throne of Asia remained illegitimate, and pressed on toward Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia, a fortress island surrounded by blue walls of sea and stone. Tyre was defiant, refusing to admit Alexander into their city. And so he ordered the impossible, a causeway built across the sea, stone by stone, corpse by corpse, battered by storms and fire, until after 7 months the siege engines reached the walls and his army surged across, breaching the gates, killing thousands, crucifying hundreds, and leaving behind not just a conquered city, but a monument to the futility of resistance. From Tyre he marched to Gaza, another holdout that dared defy him, where the fighting was so brutal he was wounded by a catapult bolt and nearly killed again. But once the city fell, its leaders were dragged through the streets and the city razed, and then finally Alexander turned his gaze to Egypt. But here the story changed. Egypt, long oppressed by Persian governors, opened its arms to him, and the priests declared him the incarnation of their god, the Pharaoh reborn, a son of Ra as much as of Zeus. And in the western desert, beneath the infinite silence of Siwa, he stood before the oracle of Ammon, and whether he truly asked the question or already knew the answer, the priests hailed him as divine. And when he emerged from the temple, something in him had shifted. He no longer sought glory, he expected it, no longer asked if he could conquer the world, but when. In Egypt he founded Alexandria, not the first city to bear his name, but the one fated to last centuries beyond his bones. And as the Nile whispered behind him, he prepared for the next and greatest march into the very heart of Persia. At Gaugamela in 331 BCE, beneath a sky thick with dust and omen, Alexander faced Darius for the final time. The Persian king arrayed with a force numbering perhaps 200,000, backed by war chariots with spinning blades, cavalry from the corners of the empire, and elephants whose shadows shook the ground. But Alexander, vastly outnumbered, once again read the terrain, shifted his forces with divine clarity, and as Darius attempted to encircle him, he launched a feint, then struck the center with a cavalry charge so violent it pierced through the very core of the Persian army. Darius, fleeing for a second time, abandoning his standard, his chariot, and the last shreds of legitimacy, the Persian host collapsed, the battlefield littered with the dead, and Alexander stood victorious, not just over an army, but over an age. For, with the fall of Darius's power, the throne of Persia was now empty, and Alexander meant to claim it not as a looter, but as a king. He entered Babylon with celebration, received as a god-king, honored by priests, crowned in golden robes, then took Susa and Persepolis, the ancient heart of the empire, where the treasures of 1,000 years' gold scrolls, thrones, were brought before him, and as he walked through the palace of Xerxes, past the carved bulls and star-strewn ceilings, he saw not just an empire conquered, but one ready to be reborn in his image. But in a drunken revel, perhaps as vengeance for Persia's burning of Athens, or perhaps as ritual, he ordered the palace set ablaze, and the flames that consumed Persepolis were not merely fire, but the symbolic end of the Achaemenid world, the signal that a new master had come, and with it, a new world. But even then, Alexander did not stop. He pursued Darius into the eastern provinces, through Bactria and Sogdia, over mountain passes and icy rivers, until at last Darius was betrayed by his own men and left bleeding in a cart, discovered by Macedonian scouts too late to save him. Alexander wept for his fallen rival and gave him a burial fit for a king, vowing to punish his murderers, for he understood that with Darius's death, he alone stood between order and chaos, and if he was to rule as more than a warlord, he must become the guardian of the empire, not merely its destroyer. He adopted Persian customs, married Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian noble, integrated Persians into his administration, and began to wear the robes of an Eastern monarchs that enraged many of his Macedonian companions, who saw in this transformation a betrayal, a dilution of their culture. And when Philotas, son of the trusted general Parmenion, was accused of conspiracy, Alexander had him executed, and Parmenion too, sending a chill through the army, a signal that even old loyalty would not protect disobedience. And yet none could deny his vision, for he spoke now not of mere conquest, but of unity, of a world without borders, where Greeks and Persians, East and West, would be joined under one law, one ruler, one divine purpose. And so the fire spread, not as a plague, but as a rebirth, and Alexander, ever moving, ever burning, turned now toward the furthest edge of the map India, where legend said the land turned green with gods, and the rivers ran with diamonds, and where, beyond all reason, he meant to go. For in his mind there was no edge to the world, only the next conquest waiting to be named. The morning of Gaugamela broke beneath a moon like a cold coin, silver and distant over the dust-choked plains of Mesopotamia, where the earth itself seemed to tense with anticipation of what was to come. And as Alexander stood beneath that pale sky, surveying the impossible, an army said to number 250,000 men stretched across the fields in shimmering waves of armor, chariots laced with blades, Indian war elephants, rumbling like living towers, and banners rising like the breath of forgotten gods, he felt not fear but fate. For this was no longer a campaign of retribution or ambition, not a march to finish his father's dream or punish an ancient enemy. It had become a judgment between ages, between two visions of the world: Persian grandeur built upon inheritance and vastness, and Hellenic fury tempered by discipline and firehand. As his phalanxes stretched behind him, spears bristling like a forest ready to move, and his companion cavalry glinted in the gloom like a knife drawn from shadow, Alexander prepared not for battle but for ascension. Darius III, King of Kings, sat on a golden chariot flanked by immortals and nobles from the edges of the empire, Scythian horse archers from the steppes, Indian elephant corps, Babylonian infantry, Assyrian slingers, Bactrian lancers ball-pulled into orbit around the heart of Persian power. The field, wide and level by Darius's command, cleared to favor his chariots and sheer numbers, and he waited with confidence, convinced that no brilliance, no bravery, no boy born of Greece could stand against this immensity. But Alexander had studied the terrain as he had once studied Aristotle's scrolls, and he had marched his army by night to avoid entrapment, choosing the high ground, adjusting his flanks with exquisite care. And as dawn came full, he addressed his men not with hollow speeches, but with the gaze of one who believed himself immortal, invoking the glory of Macedon, the blood of Achilles, the justice of war. And when the signal was given, the right wing advanced at an oblique angle, baiting the Persian left into pursuit, pulling them wide, creating a gap in the line so narrow only a genius would see at hand. Alexander saw it. With a scream that pierced the clangor of shield and hoof, he drove his companions in a thunderous wedge directly at Darius's center, cutting through the heart of the Persian line like a spear through silk, killing nobles, slashing banners, scattering guards. And for the second time in their doomed rivalry, Darius fled, this time abandoning not only his royal regalia and treasury, but the idea of empire itself, galloping into the horizon with panic riding at his heels. The field was chaosed, elephants crushed beneath their own panic, Macedonian phalanxes holding firm against waves of infantry, while Parmenion on the left called for help, his forces pressured by Persian cavalry. But Alexander, tasting the collapse of centuries in that moment, refused to turn until the center broke, until the King of Kings was gone, until he could feel the spirit of Achaemenid Persia rupture beneath his heel. And when the field was his, when the banners lay in blood and silence, he turned to aid Parmenion and scattered the remaining Persian forces like leaves in wind. It was not just a victory, it was an apocalypse, the fall of the greatest army on earth, and with it the collapse of an entire world order, a civilization built upon generations of rule by divine decree, now reduced to a fugitive king and a smoldering battlefield. Babylon opened its gates to him, its priests hailing him as a chosen son, its palaces surrendered, its treasures laid at his feet, and Alexander, understanding theater as well as war, entered not as a looter but as a lawful successor, honoring temples, restoring shrines, speaking with governors, not as conqueror but as brother, wearing purple robes laced in gold, and yet never forgetting to remind them, subtly, constantly, that it was by his sword they now knelt. Susa followed, richer even than Babylon, with treasuries bursting from centuries of conquest, hundreds of tons of bullion, emeralds, engraved goblets, scrolls, and statues from every corner of the known world, and from there, the road led to Persepolis, the sacred capital of Persian kings, home of the great king's throne, built by Darius the Great and Xerxes, adorned with staircases carved with the tribute of nations, columns that scraped the sky, and reliefs so intricate they seemed to breathe stone. But Alexander did not intend to preserve this symbol. He entered it with solemnity, accepting tribute, listening to petitions, treating it as a ritual passage. But beneath the silence raged the unforgotten memory of Persian invasions, the desecration of Athens, the temple of Erection, the tales his mother had whispered of how Xerxes once mocked the gods of Greeceland in a night of feasting, perhaps drunk, perhaps deliberate, perhaps a final act of symbolic purification. He gave the command, or perhaps nodded when the idea was raised, and Persepolis burned. The palace went up in flames that reached the stars, golden ceilings melting, cedar beams shrieking as they collapsed, stone cracking beneath the heat. And the fire was so vast it lit the mountains for miles, and whether it was vengeance, theater, or hubris, it marked the end of Achaemenid Persia, not only in flesh, but in memory, reduced to ash beneath the boots of a man not yet 25. Yet even then, the world did not stop, and Darius, ever fleeing, ever surviving, retreated deeper into Bactria, where satraps and warlords grew restless, watching the sun of empire fade with each hoofbeat, and Alexander, tireless as the gods he now claimed as kin, pursued him across deserts and rivers, over ranges choked with ice, through lands where maps ended and legends began crossing the Zagros, then through Ecbatana, collecting tribute and forging new satrapies as he went, not conquering by sword alone, but by ritual, by marriage, by the promise of continuity wrapped in new dominion. And yet, in these wild lands, resistance sparked not from Darius, but from his own followers, who, desperate to retain some shred of power, betrayed their king, stabbing him in the back and leaving him bleeding in a cart on the roadside, where Macedonian scouts found him gasping his last, too late to save, too early to celebrate. And when Alexander came upon the corpse of his greatest rival, he wept, not for the man, but for the dream now ended. For with Darius dead, there was no more chase, no more worthy adversary, only the slow, hard labor of governance and unification, the harder war of peace. He sent Darius's killers to execution, flaying Bessus, the satrap who claimed kingship, declaring himself not just conqueror, but avenger, the lawful heir to Cyrus, to Darius the Great, to all the kings of fire and gold. And with that claim, he declared the creation of a new empire, not Persian, but Alexandrian, a fusion of East and West, of sword and scripture, of lightning and law. But the dream would not come easily, for resistance now came from within. His own men murmured at his adoption of Persian dress, of court rituals foreign to Macedonian pride, of the bowed head, the prostration known as proskynesis. And when he tried to introduce it, even his closest companions balked, for they had followed a king, not a god. And Alexander, furious, abandoned the custom, but not the intent. The death of Darius created a vacuum, not only in politics, but in identity, and Alexander, always shifting, began to surround himself with Persians, appointing them to key positions, encouraging marriages between his men and Persian women, seeking to blend the bloodlines of his conquests into one unified nobility. And though noble in vision, it sowed unrest in the ranks. The arrest and execution of Philotas on suspicion of treason, followed by the quiet assassination of his father, Parmenion, one of the oldest and most loyal of Philip's generals, marked a turning point where fear entered the heart of the Macedonian command, and Alexander, now more remote, more imperial, began to walk not as a man among soldiers, but as a god among petitioners. And yet his momentum did not slow. He founded cities bearing his name across the vast new territory, from Egypt to Sogdia, laying out grids, installing governors, opening schools, promoting Greek language and culture, while allowing local traditions to survive, building not just an empire of conquest, but of culture. And it was here, in these borderlands of what had once been called the known world, that he married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian noble, not out of lust, but strategy, a gesture of fusion and legitimacy, an attempt to create a dynasty that could hold what he had taken. But even in marriage, the war within him raged between East and West, God and man, vision and loyalty, and the tension broke in one infamous night when, drunk and brimming with fury at the challenge to his eastern ways, Alexander killed Cletus the Black with his own spear, the same man who had saved his life at Granicus, the same man who had spoken too freely against Persian customs, who had insulted the divinity Alexander now claimed, and whose blood poured across the banquet floor as the silence of horror filled the tent. In the days that followed, Alexander wept and fasted, sick with grief, torn between the memory of friendship and the throne he now carried like a curse. And his men, though they forgave him, saw now the line had shifted irrevocably, that their king no longer belonged to them, but to something else, something vast, consuming, divine, and terrifying. And yet still he moved east, insatiable, driven, whispering of oceans beyond India, of the outer limits of earth and heaven. And to those who followed him, the fire in his eyes burned brighter than any crown, for they were no longer marching beneath a mortal banner, but chasing a star of thunder that walked in human form, reshaping the world with every step, and promising that if they followed him to the edge of creation, they too might share in his immortality. The world had fallen beneath his feet like waves retreating before a storm. Yet Alexander's gaze did not rest upon the lands already won. Babylon's towers gleamed behind him. Persepolis lay in sacred ash, and the tombs of Darius and Cyrus watched in silence, but his heart beat for the lands beyond the maps, where the edges of the earth were said to crack open into oceans, where monstrous rivers coiled through emerald jungles, and gods walked among men cloaked in golden smoke. And so the young king, who had carved an empire greater than any before him, marched ever eastward, not to rule, not to plunder, but to see if there was, at the world's final gate, something that could rival his fire. With his new wife Roxana beside him, and his Macedonian veterans behind him, men grizzled and scarred, weary of the dream but bound to it as surely as breath, he turned toward India, that land of legend whose name whispered with serpents, philosophers, and riches enough to melt a throne, and crossed into the high passes of the Hindu Kush, where snow bit like spears, and the silence of the peaks felt older than the gods themselves. losing hundreds to exposure, landslides, and starvation. For these mountains did not bow to empires, and yet he pressed forward, shivering in Persian cloaks, leading from the front, reminding all who followed that he was not born to sit, but to ascend. In Bactria and Sogdia, he faced fresh rebellions, revolts led by warlords, clinging to the last breath of Persian defiance. And Alexander crushed them with the same fire that had burned Thebes, building fortresses in impossible places, taking cities by storm, and capturing or eliminating leaders one by one, until only Spitamenes, the most elusive and cunning of them all, remained to challenge him. In a brutal campaign of attrition, Alexander hunted him across rivers and deserts, relying on his growing corps of local allies, forging bonds of blood and honor, until finally Spitamenes was betrayed by his own and delivered headless to the Macedonian camp, another ghost swallowed by the tide of this endless march. But conquest was no longer enough, and Alexander now dreamed of unity, of something no king before him had dared imagine, a world not ruled merely by sword and tribute, but by fusion, by shared law, shared blood, shared gods. He married Roxana in a ceremony meant to bind East and West in flesh, and as he marched into India, he invited philosophers and seers to his tent, listened to local sages speak of cycles and souls, discussed eternity with naked mystics who stared into the sun without flinching, and found in their teachings echoes of what he had long suspected, that divinity was not given, it was seized, lived, born into the world, not by temples, but by will. And so he descended from the passes and entered the land of the Indus, where kings ruled in jeweled courts and elephants waited behind walls of bronze and bamboo. And here he met his fiercest foe, not in numbers, but in vision, for King Poros of the Porava stood not as a supplicant, but as an equal, refusing surrender, sending no tribute. And when the armies met on the muddy banks of the Hellespont river during monsoon, the sky wept as if to warn them both. The river swelled with rain and thunder, and Poros, seated atop a great elephant flanked by thousands of archers, cavalry, and war beasts, prepared to meet fate, not with fear, but majesty. But Alexander, master of the impossible, crossed the river in the night, under cover of storm, leading a portion of his forces across swollen currents and through unknown terrain to strike Poros's flank at dawn. The battle that followed was like none seen before, elephants crashing through phalanxes, men crushed beneath tusks and hooves, arrows blotting out the sun, Macedonian cavalry wheeling in tight arcs to harass the flanks, and Alexander himself, shining like fire through the mist, commanding not with shouts but presence, until the Indian army buckled beneath exhaustion, and Poros, wounded, proud, defiant, stood atop his elephant to the end. When the battle ceased and Poros was brought before him, bleeding and bound, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, and the great king replied simply, like a king, a phrase so potent in its dignity that Alexander moved beyond calculation, restored his lands, made him a satrap, and declared him brother. For in Poros he saw a mirror not of blood, but of spirit, and in honoring him he honored the ideal of kingship itself. After Hellespont, Alexander wished to go further, toward the Ganges, to the ocean he believed lay at the edge of the world. But his men, after years of war, refused. They stood beneath the monsoon sky and begged for home, wept, shouted, argued, And finally, Alexander, for perhaps the only time in his life, relented, turning back, but not by the easy path. He divided his forces, sending part by sea under Nearchus, while he himself led the rest through the Gedrosian desert, a hellscape of sand and stone, where the sun boiled from above and the land offered no water, no shelter, no mercy. And there, among dunes and skulls, Alexander faced not enemy blades but the cruel indifference of nature, losing thousands to thirst and heat, watching friends die in silence, his army shatter not from war but from emptiness. And still he marched, refusing to drink more than the lowest soldier, walking beside them, suffering beside them. And by the time they emerged months later, skin blistered, sandals blood-worn, there was no man alive who doubted that their king was more than mortal. For what god, what emperor would choose that path? And yet he had survived it, the beating heart of his empire, where he declared new reforms, new cities, new plans. For his mind was never still, and now he dreamed not of conquest, but of unification, on a scale beyond imagination, melding East and West through education, marriage, law, and blood. He held the mass wedding at Susa, marrying hundreds of his officers to Persian noblewomen, including his own marriage to Statera, daughter of Darius, while keeping Roxana at his side, seeking to birth a dynasty that would unite the bloodlines of the world. And yet beneath the ceremonies, resentment brewed. Many Macedonians felt cast aside, foreign customs alienated them, and Alexander, once their shining star, had become something distant, imperial, unknowable. He began to speak of gods more often, demanded honors once reserved for divinity, walked in robes heavy with gold and incense. And yet still he planned roads stretching across continents, harbors to connect seas, a common coin, a common script, an empire of peoples rather than conquest. And perhaps, had time allowed, he would have made it real. But fate, like war, has no master. And in the early summer of 323 BCE, as he prepared to march into Arabia with fresh forces, Alexander fell ill not from wound nor blade, but from something unseen, a fever that rose like smoke and would not leave. And over days in the palace at Babylon, surrounded by physicians, priests, generals, and wives, his strength drained. He could no longer speak, only gesture, and when asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered, "They say, to the strongest," a phrase as cryptic as it was catastrophic, for with his death, the unity he had forged unraveled into chaos. He died on June 10th or 11th, perhaps of fever, perhaps of poison, perhaps of exhaustion, his body still radiant, his face still youthful. And when the soldiers passed by him one last time, they wept not only for their king, but for the dream, for the thunder that had walked beside them, for the fire that had burned brighter than the stars. He was 32, and yet in those brief years he had redrawn the world, shattered old borders, rewritten kingship, and lit a torch that would pass from hand to hand, from Rome to Byzantium, from the Abbasids to Napoleon, from every soul who dared to rise beyond their limits and challenge the very shape of fate. And in the centuries that followed, his cities would endure. His name would be carved into stone and song, his legend twisted, mythologized, painted in every hue from god to demon. But beneath all of it stood a truth more unyielding than marble, that Alexander, son of Philip, child of thunder and storm, crossed the known world not merely to conquer it, but to understand it, to join it, to become it, and in doing so became not merely a king of men but an idea, eternal, unburied, echoing. Still, wherever ambition dares to ask, how far can we go? The sky over the Indus Valley had turned to iron when Alexander crossed into the lands where maps turned to myths, where the rivers ran broad as seas and the very air seemed to pulse with secrets older than Olympian gods. And it was here beyond Bactria, beyond the ridgelines of the Hindu Kush, in a world ruled not by logic but by omens, that he met his greatest living adversary, the man whom time would call the Elephant King, and the battle they would fight in rain, shadowed by beasts, choked in the cries of dying men would not be a contest of ambition alone, but a thunderclap between destinies, between two titans born beneath different stars, each a mirror to the other's flame. The march to the Hellespont was brutal, a trial of mud and monsoon, with thick jungle hemming the Macedonian phalanx in on all sides. Elephants crashing in the distance like ghosts of war yet to come, and men murmuring of river gods and golden temples buried beneath vine and fog, for this was no longer the empire of Darius. Polished and familiar, this was a place where even Alexander, crowned with legend, walked like a trespasser in a holy realm. Porus, king of the Porava, stood tall even before he mounted his war elephant, a man of immense stature and fire, commanding not with shrieks but with silence, draped in silks, soaked in storm water, his armor burnished bronze, his confidence unshaken, even as news reached him that the son of Zeus approached not as a conqueror, but as a whirlwind of fate. And Porus did not flee, did not sue for peace, did not flinch when emissaries came to urge submission. He prepared instead to fight, gathering tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, archers, and most notably, over 200 war elephants, trained for battle from youth, tusks fitted with iron, towers affixed to their backs, each beast a fortress unto itself. And when he drew his line upon the wet soil near the swollen Hydaspes River, he did so not as a desperate prince, but as one who knew he stood on sacred ground, and that the gods of his homeland would not permit surrender. Alexander, meanwhile, studied the rising river and the placements of Porus's forces with the eye of a man who had defeated kings by the architecture of terrain, not just by steel, and where others saw an impassable torrent, he saw opportunity. Under cover of thunder and night, he split his forces, leading a strike group upstream to cross where the river was narrow and fast, the rain cloaking the sound of hooves and boats. And when dawn came and the battle horns blared, the elephant king turned to face not a slow river assault, but a god risen from the floodplain. The clash was apocalyptic. Macedonian spears met Indian elephants in a ballet of horror. The jungle floor slick with rain and blood, men crushed beneath ton-weighted hooves, javelins launched into the air only to vanish into the hide of monsters. The phalanx buckling and reforming again and again under the sheer terror of charging war beasts, while Alexander, gleaming beneath a bronze helm shaped like a lion's head, led the companion cavalry around the flanks, cutting deep into the Indian ranks but always forced back by the looming wall of tusks and towers. Porus rode high above the chaos, directing with a serene rage, hurling spears with uncanny precision, while beneath him, His elephant trampled the earth like a living thunderclap. And the two kings, one from the Aegean, one from the Ganges, locked eyes again and again across the maelstrom, two wills crashing against each other like continents colliding. The elephants, maddened by wounds and fire, began to turn on their own, goring friend and foe alike, and Alexander pressed the advantage, ordering archers to target the mahouts, disorienting the beasts, until the great wall of the Indian line began to waver, not from cowardice, but exhaustion. And even as Porus fought on, bleeding from shoulder and thigh, his army slowly gave ground, not in rout, but in weariness, like a tide going out tanned when the last of his war elephants dropped to its knees, not from a wound, but from sheer fatigue. Porus remained standing atop it, head held high, refusing to yield until the field was entirely lost. Captured but not broken, the Elephant King was brought before Alexander, who saw in him not a defeated enemy, but a reflection of the kingship he had always aspired to, noble, unyielding, proud, without arrogance. And when he asked how Porus wished to be treated, the answer came back, not as plea, but as decree, like a king. And Alexander, who had seen so many rulers grovel in defeat, was moved not to mockery, but to awe, restoring Porus his kingdom, granting him even greater lands, and binding him not in chains, but in respect. For in this moment, Alexander forged not merely victory, but alliance, recognizing that true greatness did not destroy, it elevated. But even after this triumph, he was not finished. The dream burned hotter than ever, for beyond the Ganges lay realms he had never seen. Rumors of kingdoms vaster than Persia, armies riding chariots of silver, and cities that glittered beneath trees of gold. And Alexander wanted all of it, not for plunder, not for tribute, but for the sheer act of seeing, of bringing the world into his embrace, as if to kiss the infinite. Yet his men, veterans of 20,000 miles of march, their bones brittle with hardship, their hearts full of buried brothers and homes left behind, began to falter, not in loyalty, but in Solent at the banks of the Hiphasis. When Alexander called them to march further east, they stood as one and refused. Coenus spoke for them, his voice shaking but firm, saying that though they would follow him into Hades, they had nothing left to give, that they had reached the edge not of the map, but of their humanity. And, for the first time, Alexander relented, stepping back not in weakness, but in wisdom, marking the end of conquest. But the way back would be no triumphal procession. He divided the army, sending part by sea under Nearchus to chart the coast, while he led the remainder through the Gedrosian desert, a land cursed by gods and time alike, a furnace of sand and silence, where entire companies perished of thirst, where horses collapsed mid-stride and vultures circled without flapping their wings. And Alexander, though offered water in golden bowls, refused to drink unless every soldier drank with him, an oath that saw him near death more than once, but bound him to his men as few kings in history had ever dared. When they emerged, emaciated and broken, they had not conquered a nation, but survived the impossible. And Alexander wept not for lost men, but for the price of ambition, for the scars his glory had etched across so many lives. And from there, he returned to Susa, to Babylon, two cities that now awaited him not as a god, but as something stranger, a man who had returned from the world's edge, carrying dust from places beyond myth, a king who had faced elephants and silence and his own limits, and who still stood. Yet something in him had changed. The fire had not dimmed, but it had deepened, become more than hunger, shaped now by pain, loss, and the strange clarity that comes after one has seen the face of death and chosen to keep walking. He began planning new projects, harbors, roads, the unification of his people, not by sword but by law, by marriage, by vision. Marrying more Persian noblewomen to his officers, blending bloodlines as if to sculpt a new humanity, and still he dreamed of Arabia, of the Western Sea, of lands yet unseen, even as Babylon's priests warned him not to enter their sacred gates on a certain day. Reading signs in the stars that spoke of doom, and whether through arrogance or apathy, he ignored them, stepped through the gates, and shortly after fell ill, perhaps from poison, perhaps from malaria, perhaps from the exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of the world to London. As he lay on his deathbed, unable to speak, his generals gathered and asked, "To whom do you leave your empire?" And he whispered, through cracked lips and a fading soul, "To the strongest." With that, the man who had crossed the known world, fought beasts and kings, survived betrayal, river, desert, and fate itself, slipped from time and into eternity, leaving behind no successor, no peace, only a legacy so vast it defied burial, and the world still echoing with the footfalls of his march would never again be the same. It was not the sword that killed Alexander, nor the spear, nor any wound that men could see, a silence that crept upon him like dusk over a ruined city, a silence born not from defeat, for he had never known it, but from the weight of having reached too far, from the terrible stillness that follows the thunder when the storm has passed and the sky finds nothing left to burn. And it was in Babylon where old empires died and new ones always dreamed that the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen began to dim like a star, collapsing under its own brilliance. He had returned not with chariots of plunder, but with a vision, a design grander than war itself, the dream of welding together a fractured world through marriage, administration, road, and ritual, a vision carved not in stone, but in the blood of those who had marched with him from Pella to the Indus, and now, with Persia pacified, India behind him, and Arabia in his sights, he set about building not seas for those he had planted, like seeds across the continent, but order, cohesion, permanence, as if he could now root his flame into earth and let it bloom into civilization. Engineers, astronomers, and architects, all summoned by a man who could no longer be called merely a king, but something stranger, a bridge between worlds, a man become metaphor, a mind still racing long after his body had begun to slow. And yet, for all the movement, there was a shadow gathering at the edges of his empire, a crack running through the marble mask of his legacy. For his men, the old guard of Macedon, the veterans who had followed him since Granicus, watched with increasing unease as their king surrounded himself with Persians, appointed Easterners to command, and adopted foreign customs that seemed less like homage and more like transformation. And though many still loved him, they no longer understood him. For the boy who had once invoked Achilles now bowed before Babylonian priests, sacrificed to foreign gods, and spoke of divine union and universal monarchy, not in the language of home, but in riddles too vast to hold. He held the mass wedding at Susa with pomp unmatched in history, binding Macedonian officers to Persian brides, including Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian noble, and Statera, daughter of Darius. And when he ordered his soldiers to adopt Persian dress, to kneel in proskynesis, to speak not as conquerors, but as brothers of the East, grumbles turned to mutiny, quiet and sullen. Even those closest to him, like Callisthenes the philosopher, who once chronicled his deeds, found themselves. But, living God, Hephaestion, his closest friend, the man whose soul had marched beside his own since youth. Others whispered poison, and in that death something in Alexander had broken, or perhaps shifted. He built a grand pyre for him, held ceremonies not seen since Achilles mourned Patroclus, ordered temples constructed in his name, and in the long nights that followed, walked alone beneath the stars, as if waiting for some voice to answer, for the silence to lift, but it never did. And where once he had moved with fury and flame, now he moved with purpose, but no peace, chasing not territory, but meaning, seeking to turn the heat of his ambition into the light of a system that could outlive him. He planned roads to Arabia, fleets to sail the Persian Gulf and chart the coasts of the world, sent men like Nearchus and one Zacritus to map new harbors and lands, restored temples desecrated by war, laid out new cities in grids of reason and grandeur. But even as he wove order, the seams began to strain, for the empire had no heart without him, no heir of age to follow, no structure save that which bent to his singular will. For they knew that even the brightest flame must burn out, and when it did, there would be no peace, only knives. And then, in the spring of 323 BCE, as the Euphrates shimmered in the heat and omens filled the sky, eclipses, strange winds, birds flying against the sun, Alexander fell ill. At first, it was thought to be exhaustion, a fever caught from the swamps, or the wine, or the gods. Sacrifices were offered, but nothing stilled the fever, and as it worsened, the court collapsed into paralysis. For without Alexander, there was no empire, only pieces, Macedonians, Persians, Egyptians, Bactrians, all bound not by law, but by the orbit of a single soul, now flickering into darkness. He could no longer speak, could only gesture, and when asked to whom he left his empire, he is said to have whispered to the strongest praise that would fracture the world, for no man knew what it meant, or whether he had said it at all. And within hours of his death, on June 10th or 11th, the records are divided. The city held its breath, not in mourning, but in terror, and generals with swords sheathed in memory and resentment. Perdiccas tried to hold the center, declaring himself regent for the unborn child, while Ptolemy seized Egypt, Lysimachus took Thrace, and Antigonus the one-eyed grasped at Asia, each claiming loyalty to Alexander's vision, but each ruling in his own name. The empire he had forged with blood and brilliance became a carcass torn by its own heirs, and though statues were raised, and coins still bore his image, and poets sang of his glories, the truth beneath it all was brutal. His dream had no body without him, the fields of succession. Yet the shadow of Babylon was not just darkness, it was memory, the shape he had left behind, the outline of a world reimagined. And even as his generals feuded and carved kingdoms from his corpse, they still claimed him, still tried to echo him, still summoned his name like a spell to justify their rule. The Hellenistic age that followed bore his fingerprints in every corner. Cities built in his name, from Alexandria in Egypt to Ai Khanum on the Oxus. Greek spoken from Libya to Punjab. Philosophies exchanged between Athens and Bactria. Temples where Heracles and Ahura Mazda shared walls, and even when Rome rose, it did so in awe of him. Its generals studying his campaigns as blueprints for glory. Its emperors visiting his tomb to weep and wonder. And yet the man himself, the soul that had once ridden Bucephalus across the dusty plains of Issus, that had stared down Darius at Gaugamela, that had embraced the Elephant King and burned Persepolis, remained elusive, not saint, not tyrant, not wholly human, something more and less. A question carved into the bones of the world. What drives a man to conquer the earth? Not for power, but for something greater, something unnameable. In Babylon, he had tried to answer that question not with words, but with empire, with vision, but the fever had taken him before the world could catch its breath. Before peace could grow from the soil he had soaked in fire, and so his legacy remained unfinished, as vast and broken and beautiful as the lands he had crossed. The man died, but the echo endured in poems, in ruins, in bloodlines, in dreams and, even now, or beside the Indus, where elephants once charged through the mist. If one listens closely, beneath the hush of time, one can still hear it, not the shout of conquest, but the breath of something greater, a boy who became a storm, and in Babylon's shadow, became the world. The thunder fades, not in silence, but in echo, rolling out over the centuries, like a dying drumbeat, whose rhythm still shapes the bones of empires. For though Alexander the Great had breathed his last in the thick Babylonian heat, his voice carried through history, not as a memory, but as a myth, still wearing a human face, and the world he left behind, fractured, yearning, unfinished, was less an empire than a question, an inheritance written in ambition and ash. In the days after his death, the palace halls echoed with confusion and dread, generals pacing beneath painted ceilings, each one aware that without the sun at the center, the solar system of conquest would collapse into dust, and knives. Roxana, pregnant with the only legitimate heir, became both sacred and endangered. And Perdiccas, declared regent, found himself holding a kingdom already slipping through his fingers, as Ptolemy, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Seleucus circled like hawks, each claiming part of Alexander's ghost to forge their own crowns. And so the wars of the Diadochi began, long and brutal. Not merely battles for land, but for narrative, for identity, for the right to say we were his true heirs. And yet none of them could replicate him, for he had been not only a conqueror, but a weaver of contradictions, Greek and Persian, philosopher and warrior, god and man, a figure whose very life resisted ownership. As his generals turned on one another, Perdiccas slain in the Nile, Ptolemy establishing a dynasty in Egypt, Seleucus carving out the eastern bulk of the empire, from Syria to Bactria. Alexander's son, born Alexander IV, became a pawn in a game far greater than any throne, and within a decade, both he and Roxana were murdered, suffocated in a tower. The bloodline of the great king extinguished before it had time to grow into shadow. And yet even as the family tree was cut at its root, the branches it had already spawned flourished. Alexandria's multiplied across the map. Language and law rippled outward in Hellenistic waves, and Greek became the tongue not only of merchants and governors, but of priests, poets, and philosophers from the shores of Libya to the valleys of the Oxus. And in this spread, the shape of Alexander changed. No longer merely the king of Macedon, he became Sikandar to the Persians and later the Arabs. A righteous ruler with twin horns upon his crown, who built a wall to hold back Gog and Magog at the ends of the earth, protector of civilization and chosen of God. In Egypt, the Ptolemies enshrined him as a second Osiris, building his tomb in the heart of Alexandria, gleaming structure of glass and gold, where Caesar would one day weep and Augustus lay flowers, and though its location would one day vanish, beneath sand and city, its memory haunted emperors for centuries, each desperate to see the face of the one who had dared to grasp the sky. In the Roman world, Alexander became more than history. He became the mirror into which every Caesar stared, from Trajan to Caracalla, who styled himself as a second Alexander and visited every battlefield the great conqueror had known, donning his armor, whispering his name, dreaming not of ruling but of becoming, and yet none could ever quite catch the storm he had ridden. For Alexander had not simply sought dominion, he had sought unity, transcendence, a fusion of cultures that could not be forced by spear but invited by vision. And this is what so many missed in trying to mimic his path. The thunder was not just conquest, it was clarity, the moment when a world broken into tribes and hatred could be glimpsed as a whole. In India, the tales of Alexander became epics blended into local myth. He was no longer the outsider, but the bringer of fate, remembered in Sanskrit texts as Alakosudara, the invincible one who came from the west and vanished like a monsoon wind, and in Persian literature, he became the hero of the Shahnameh, a just king whose journey spanned not only nations but metaphysical trials, a man who passed through the heavens and conversed with philosophers under sacred trees, whose conquest was not of land but of self. And still the thunder echoed in art, where coins bore his face for centuries, crowned with the horns of Ammon, eyes raised as if searching for Olympus. In literature, where the Alexander romance spun his life into a tapestry of dragons, flying machines, underwater voyages, and divine revelations, a tale so enduring it would be copied in Latin, Syriac, Arabic, and Old French, read by monks and emirs alike, each retelling adding a new facet to the jewel of his legend. And though time marched on and new empires rose, each bore a shadow shaped like his, for in every act of sweeping ambition in Rome, Byzantium, Baghdad, Paris, London, the whisper came again, remember Alexander, remember the one who dared. And yet behind the myth there remains the man born in Pella, taught by Aristotle, molded by Philip, haunted by Achilles, driven by a hunger not for power but for immortality, a boy who once wept when there were no more worlds to conquer, and later discovered the bitter truth that there are always more. But the cost is not counted in gold or glory, it is counted in the souls of those who follow you into the fire. He left behind no manual, no code, only cities and graves, dreams and ghosts. And perhaps that is why he endures, because his story is not finished, because every age finds in him what it needs, a tyrant, a hero, a god, a warning, a dream. And as the centuries roll forward, as empires crack and reform like continents drifting on molten time, the thunder he once loosed over Issus, over Gaugamela, over the Hydaspes and the Gedrosian desert, still lingers in the breath between legends. And when you stand upon a hill where once his army marched, or in a ruined citadel bearing his name, or in a library where his tale is told anew. You may feel it, that sudden hush before the storm returns, that pulse in your chest that does not belong to you, but to the echo of a man who tried to become the world, and in doing so became eternal.